This is a reading of Charles Bzerman's A Relationship Between Reading and Writing, the Conversational Model. Please note that this is a scholarly text intended for an audience of the discourse community of writing studies. So if you are not a member of that discourse communities, you may find that there is language and phrasing and maybe even tone and organization of this text that you are not familiar with, or that you may need to look up certain words and such to fully understand this text. But that is part of understanding that when you sit down to read something, your job as a rhetorical reader is to investigate, are you the intended audience? Who do you think is the intended audience? Maybe research the author a little bit, or at least the year and context in which the text was published, etc. In this case, I'm giving some of that information to you now, right? I'm letting you know who the audience is and what it was intended for. But you should also maybe take a look at how this writer puts together their argument for this discourse community, right? How do they open up their argument? Does it begin contextually? How is that context delivered? How explicit are they about their argument? How does Bazerman continue to make his claims, and what kind of evidence is he using to support his claims? All those types of acknowledgments of a text helps you read rhetorically. So just something to keep in mind. Let's get going. The connection between what a person reads and what that person then writes seems so obvious as to be truistic, and current research and theory about writing have been content to leave the relationship as a truism, making no serious attempt to define either mechanisms or consequences of the interplay between reading and writing. The lack of attention to this essential bond of reading and writing, of literacy, results in part from the many disciplinary divorces in language studies over the last half century. For examples, speech has moved out, taking rhetoric with it. Linguistics has staked a claim to all skilled language behavior, but has attended mostly to spoken language. Sociology and anthropology have offered more satisfactory lodgings for the study of the social context and meaning of literacy, and English has gladly rid itself of basic reading to concern itself purely with the higher reading of literary criticism. Writing, in its three incarnations as basic composition, creative, and vestigial advanced composition, remains an unappreciated houseguest of literature. All these splits have made it difficult for those of us interested in writing to conceive of writing in terms of broad enough to make essential connections. Our accommodation has been to focus on the individual writer alone, with the blank piece of paper, and to ignore the many contexts in which the writing takes place. This essay will review developments in composition in light of this difficulty, propose a remedy in the form of something called a conversational model for the interplay of reading and writing, and then explore the implications of the model for teaching. One of the older views, with ancient antecedents, held that a neophyte writer, that just means a new writer, was an apprentice to a tradition that the writer became acquainted with through reading. The beginning student studied rules and practiced set forms derived from the best of previous writing. Analysis and imitation of revered texts was the core of more advanced study of writing. The way to good writing was to mold oneself into the contours of prior greatness. Although current composition theory largely rejects this tradition or apprenticeship as stultifying, teachers of other academic disciplines still find the model attractive, because writing in content disciplines requires mastery of disciplinary literature. The accumulated knowledge and accepted forms of writing circumscribe what and how a student may write in disciplines such as history, biology, and philosophy. Recent work in composition has chosen instead to emphasize the writer's original voice, which has its source in an independent self. The model of the individual writer shaping thought through language informs recent investigations into the composing process, growth of syntactic maturity, and the source of error. We have aided the student in the struggle to express the self by revealing the logic of syntax, by asking for experiential and personal writing, and by offering techniques for pre-writing and invention to help the student get closer to the well springs of thought that lie inside. Even traditional rhetoric finds its new justification in the reflection of organic psychological realities. By establishing the importance of the voice of the writer and the authority of personal perception, we have learned to give weight to what the student wants to say, to be patient with the complex process of writing, to offer sympathetic advice on how to rather on what not to, and to help the student discover the personal motivations to learn to write. Yet the close observation of the plight of the individual writer has led us to remember that writing is not contained entirely in the envelope of experience, native thought, and personal motivation to communicate. Communication, instead, presupposes an audience. That deference to that audience has led to a revived concern for the forms of what is now called standard written English. E.D. Hirsch, in The Philosophy of Composition, locates the entire philosophy in readability, that is, concern for the audience. We have also noticed that most writing our students do during college is in the context of their academic studies. Interest in writing across the curriculum has been the result. In the most thoughtful study coming out of this approach, called The Development of Writing Abilities by James Britton and his colleagues, they begin to notice that students use readings, but in personal and original ways, in order to write for their academic courses. Sourcebook material may be used in various ways involving different levels of activity by the writer. We may begin to understand those various ways and different levels of activity Britton refers to if we consider each piece of writing as a contribution to an ongoing written conversation. Conversation requires absorption of what prior speakers have said, consideration of how earlier comments relate to the responder's thoughts, and a response framed to the situation and the responder's purposes. Until a final statement is made or participants disengage themselves, the process of response continues. The immediacy of spoken conversation does, I must admit, differ significantly from the reflectiveness of written conversation. But the differences more illuminate the special character of writing than diminish the force of the model. Speech melody, gestural communication, and rapidly shifting dynamics and immediate validation on one side are set against explicitness, development, complexity, contemplation, and revision on the other. The written conversation also may bring together a more diffuse range of participants than the spoken one. Although the example of an exchange of office memos or the closed circle represented in professional journals, for example, indicates that such is not always the case. Further, in spoken conversation, the makers of previous comments are more likely to be the auditors of the response. But again, the counterexamples of the teacher who turns one student's questions into the occasion for a lecture to the entire class, or the printed back and forth of a literary war, suggest that this distinction should not be oversimplified. The conversational model points up the fact that writing occurs within the context of previous writing and advances the total sum of the whole discourse. Earlier comments provide subjects at issue, factual content, ideas to work with, and models of discourse appropriate to that subject. Later comments build on what came before and may therefore go farther than that. Later comments also define themselves against the earlier, even as they dispute particulars or redefine issues, add new material, or otherwise shift the discussion. If, as teachers of writing, we want to prepare our students to enter into the written interchanges of their chosen disciplines and the various discussions of personal and public interest, we must cultivate various techniques of absorbing, reformulating, commenting on, and using reading. In the tradition/apprentice model, such skills were fostered, but only implicitly under the umbrella assignment of the research paper, and they were not given explicit careful attention there. Only access to the tradition of information gathering and acknowledgement of the tradition, which was in documentation, were the focal of instruction. In the newer model of the voice of the individual self, assignments such as the research paper are superfluous, remaining only as vestiges of former syllabi or the penance imposed on a service department. The model of the conversation, however, suggests a full curriculum of skills and stages in the process of relating new comments to previously written materials. The following partial catalog of stages, skills, and assignments point toward the kinds of issues that might be addressed in the writing courses. The suggestions are in the form of a framework rather than of specific lessons in order to leave each teacher free to interpret the consequences of the model through the matrix of individual thoughts, experiences, and teaching styles. Similarly, the teacher will need to interpret the model through those conversations that are most familiar and important to students. Given the diversity of existing written conversations and the variety of individual responses, it is not profitable to prescribe a single course for everyone. Intelligent response begins with accurate understanding of prior comments. Again, that means whatever was written before. Not just of the facts and ideas stated, but of what the other writer was trying to achieve. A potential respondent needs to know not just the claims a writer was making, but also whether the writer was trying to call established beliefs into question or simply add some detail to generally agreed upon ideas. The respondent needs to be able to tell whether a prior statement was attempting to arouse emotions or to call forth dispassionate judgment, for example. The more we understand of the dynamics as well as the content of a conversation, the more we have to respond to. Vague understanding is more than careless, it is sporific. Particular writing assignments can help students become more perceptive readers and can help break down the tendency toward vague inarticulateness resulting from purely private reading. Paraphrase encourages precise understanding of individual terms and statements. The act of translating thoughts from one set of words to another makes the student consider exactly what was said and what was not. Summary reveals the structure of arguments and the continuity of thought. The student must ferret out the important claims and those elements that unify the entire piece of writing. Both paraphrase and summary will also be useful skills when, in the course of making original arguments, the student will have to refer to the thoughts of others with some accuracy and efficiency. Finally, having students analyze the technique of writing in relation to the writing's apparent purpose will make students sensitive to the ways writing can create effects that go beyond the overt content. Analysis of propaganda and advertising will provide the extreme and easy cases. But analysis of more subtle designs, such as that of legal arguments, for example, or of reports of biological research, will more fully reveal the purposive nature of writing. The next stage, reacting to reading, gives students a sense of their own opinions and an identity defined against the reading material, as they try to reconcile what they read with what they already think. Students begin to explore their assumptions and frameworks of thought. At first, their responses may be uninformed, either fending off the new material or acquiescing totally to what appears to be the indisputable authority of the printed word. But with time and opportunities to articulate their changing responses, students can become more comfortable with the questions raised by their reading. They start to enter into a more dialectical relationship with those who have written before. Prior assimilated reading becomes grist for processing new reading. So 3 kinds of exercise encourage the development of more extensive and thoughtful reactions, such as marginal comments on the reading, having reading journals, and informal reaction types of essays. From early in the semester, teachers should encourage students to record their thoughts about the readings in marginal notes. The teacher must be careful to distinguish this kind of reaction of annotation from more familiar study skills kind of content annotation. Perhaps by suggesting that content annotations go on the inside margin and reactions to the text maybe should go on the wider outside margins. This reaction in the margins increases the student's awareness of moment-by-moment responses to individual statements and examples. Then there's the reading journals. Reading journals written after each day's reading give the student additional room to explore the immediate response at greater length and to develop larger themes. Again, the teacher must insist on the distinction between content summaries and reactions to texts, no matter how tentative the latter may at first be. Finally, the informal response essay, that type of essay allows the student to develop a single reaction at length, perhaps drawing on a number of related, more immediate responses. Here, the teacher would make sure that the response maintains contact with issues growing out of the reading and does not become purely a rhapsody on personal theme unrelated to the reading. For all three types of assignments, the teacher can refer the student to previously held opinions, experiences, observations, and other readings as starting points for their reactions. As students become more sensitive to their responses to reading, they will spontaneously recognize likely starting points for themselves. Developing reactions leads to more formal evaluation of writing, which is measuring what a book or article actually accomplishes compared to its apparent ambitions, compared to reality, and compared to other books. The evaluative review, if treated as more than just a notice covered with a thin wash of reaction, is an effective exercise, for it requires the student both to represent and to assess the claims of the book or article. The reader's reaction to the book is also significant to the evaluation, for if the reader finds herself laughing when she should be nodding in assent, the book has failed to meet at least some of its purposes. Another kind of evaluative essay measures the claims of the reading against observable reality. The data the student compares to the book's claims may be from prior experience, new observations, formal data gathering using social science techniques, or technical experiments. Here, the teacher may discuss the variety of purposes, criteria, and techniques of data gathering in different academic disciplines as well as other human endeavors. Finally, the student may be asked to compare the claims and evidence of a number of different sources. In this kind of exercise, the students have to judge whether there is agreement, disagreement, or merely discussion of different ideas. Then, the student must identify on what level the agreement or disagreement occurs, whether of simple fact, interpretation, idea, or underlying approach. And finally, he must determine how the agreements can be fitted together and the disagreements reconciled or adjudicated. Conflicts cannot, of course, always be resolved, but students become aware of the difficulties of evaluation. Comparison of matched selections, reports requiring synthesis, reviews of literature, and annotated bibliographies are all assignments compatible with this last purpose. Reviews of literature and annotated bibliographies also give the student a coherent picture of how previous comments add up in pursuit of common issues. Students can then begin to define those issues they wish to pursue and to develop informed views on those issues. Two kinds of exercise, definitions of problem areas and research proposals, require the student to identify some issue he or she would like to know more about, to assemble the prior statements relevant to the issue, and to indicate the limitations of those sources. The proposal requires the further task of planning how the gap of knowledge in the literature can be overcome. Problem definitions and proposals are early stages of the familiar assignment of the research paper. Also familiar is a teacher's disappointment upon receiving a derivative research report instead of an original informed view in the form of a research essay. The use of preparatory assignments, not just the proposal, but also progress reports, reflections on the evidence, hypotheses testing, and idea sketches will help remind the student of the original goal of the work, while encouraging creative and detailed use of the source material. Prior instruction in the skills discussed above will also ensure that the student knows how to use reading to form independent attitudes toward the sources, and so facilitate the development of original theses. Other, more specific exercises that set the conditions for the development of informed views involve setting factual and theoretical sources against each other. 3 case studies can be compared to elicit general patterns, or one writer's theories can be measured against another factual material. These 2 assignments are, in fact, forms of critical analysis, using a coherent set of categories derived from a theoretical standpoint to sort out specifics. Such exercises show the student the many use of source material beyond simple citation of authority in support of predetermined opinion. The independent critical standpoint the student develops with respect to reading other people's work can also help the student frame and revise his or her own writing to be a purposeful and appropriate contribution to an ongoing conversation. Consideration of the relationship to previous statements will help the student decide what techniques are likely to serve new purposes. Will a redefinition of basic concepts and introduction of a new concept or the close analysis of a case study best resolve confusion, for instance? Or perhaps only a head-on persuasive argument will serve, the student might think. Further, knowledge of the literature likely to have been read by an audience helps a writer determine what needs to be explained at length and what issues need to be addressed. The model of written conversation even transforms the technical skills of reference and citation. The variety of uses to be made of quotation, for example, the options for referring to others' ideas, information, which is what quotation, paraphrase, and summary do, and the techniques of introducing and discussing source material are the tools which allow the accurate but pointed connection of one's argument to earlier statements. The mechanics of documentation, more than being an exercise in intellectual etiquette, become the means of indicating the full range of comments to which the new essay is responding. When we ask students to write purely from themselves, we may tap only those prior conversations that they are still engaged in, and so we limit the extent and variety of their thinking and writing. We can use writing to present new conversational opportunities that draw the students into wider public, professional, and academic communities. Thus, the students will learn to write within the heavily literate context they will meet in college and later in life. Whether writing tasks are explicitly embedded in prior written material, which is a review of literature or like a research paper or a legal brief, or whether they are only implicitly related to the thought and writing of others, as in like critical analyses or matters of public debate, if students are not taught the skills of creating new statements, like having something new to say through evaluating and assimilating and responding to the prior things that have been written in that conversation, we offer them the meager choice of being parrots of authority or raconteurs stocked with anecdotes for every occasion. Only a fortunate few will learn to enter the community of the literate on their own.